Thank you for joining us today. This is one of our first author visits that we're doing where we're actually in one of the branches and we have some people in the room. And then we have all of you who are joining us online. So it's the first time we've done this. This might get a little weird, so we'll figure it out, but we're glad that you've joined us. And today we're talking with 3 authors about their books discussing caregiving in America. For those of you who are online, you can post your questions in the chat. And for those of you in the room, be thinking about what you'd like to ask the authors, and we'll pose them those questions at the end of their presentations. So let me start with introducing our authors. So our first author is Kate Washington. She is the author of Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time, Eater, Catapult, and many other publications. She holds a PhD in Victorian literature from Stanford University and lives in Sacramento with her husband and 2 daughters. Chris Gabbard is the author of A Life Beyond Reason, A Disabled Boy and His Father's Enlightenment, and is a professor of English at the University of North Florida. His work has been published in numerous academic publications. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, and also sits on the board of directors of the DLC Nurse and Learn, the only nonprofit after-school and summer daycare facility in Jacksonville, Florida, for medically complex and/or significantly impaired children. And he lives with his family in Jacksonville. Deborah Cohan is the author of Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family caregiving and redemption, and a professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, Beaufort. Alongside her many academic publications, she is the author of the popular blog Socialites for Psychology Today. And I am going to turn it over to you guys. They're going to each take a turn and kind of tell you a little bit about their book, and then we'll come back at the end and do questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm going to kick it off. I'm Kate. I want to thank you for hosting us, and I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening, and also my fellow authors for joining up with us to talk about this really important issue. Caregiving is a really under-recognized crisis. I think the pandemic has made it more recognized, but it's well past time for a national conversation about the challenges that family caregiving presents and the burdens that it puts on families. I'm going to start by reading a short passage from the very beginning of my book, which is actually about the middle of my caregiving journey with my husband. I cared for my spouse through 2, actually now 3 kinds of cancer and a bone marrow transplant. And we each have different kinds of caregiving experiences, as my fellow authors will talk about in their portion of the presentation. But I'm going to start with the opening of my book. Chapter 1, Collateral Damage. In despair, I typed caregiver into Google, planning to follow it up with resources or support group. The first search the autofill suggested, however, was caregiver burnout. I sighed and clicked. That morning, I'd cried my way through a miserable appointment with my husband Brad's oncologist. The news we had received had been no grimmer than any other development over the preceding 18 months of his treatment for a rare T-cell lymphoma, which had included a debilitating stem cell transplant. But on that hot July day in 2016, I was so exhausted by the caring grind that I could no longer cope. To my embarrassment, I couldn't stop weeping or even look up. I'd always tried to project competence with Brad's physicians so they would take my questions seriously. But by 10 a.m., I was already worn out. I'd spent the morning packing lunches, running our kids to summer camp, loading a heavy wheelchair into the car, wheeling my frail husband across hot asphalt, and picking up a dozen new meds from the cancer center pharmacy, all on not enough sleep and with the knowledge that bills, laundry, and plenty else were waiting for me at home. My good caregiver mask dropped. Tears fell on the coral-colored jersey dress I'd worn to try to present myself as capable rather than a frazzled disaster. As I broke down, the oncologist chided me for not taking good enough care of myself. If I didn't, he said, how could I take care of my husband? Fragile and overextended, I heard in that question an implication that the only point of me, as a human and not coincidentally as a woman, was to care for another person. What about my own life? Didn't I deserve care in my own right? I left the office as silently as I'd sat in it, but fuming now instead of crying. The so-called self-care that the oncologist had prescribed felt like yet another task I resented, yet another obligation I had to fulfill. What I wanted was for somebody else to volunteer to care for me. Still, I dutifully went home and Googled, intending to look for resources. The top result for caregiver burnout was a quiz to determine whether the caregiver taking it was burned out. I took it. At the end, I got the breezy result, you're already toast, illustrated with a stock photo of a charred piece of bread. The website recommended taking more time for myself, getting a massage, or going on walks, arranging for supplement care so I could have an hour to myself, or even an occasional night away. But it said nothing about what to do if I was already doing those things and was burned out anyway. So that's where I chose to start my book and my story of caregiving, not at the beginning of the story of my husband's illness, which sort of snuck up on us. And that's one of the ways that many people do get into caregiving, is with that unwitting kind of sense that something is not quite right. This, I think, frequently happens with elder care in cases of memory care. You notice a parent or a loved one starting to slip. In my husband's case, he had lost a lot of weight, and he suddenly came to me one morning. It was actually the very day our younger daughter started kindergarten, and I was thinking to myself, great, I have made it. I'm going to have more time to write. I'm going to have more time to myself. I was not thinking at all about caring for an ill person. The only way I thought about care was in the context of caring for my young kids. And he came to me on the day she started kindergarten and said, I have these funny lumps on my jaw. Do you think I should see the doctor? And I looked at him and thought about the weight he'd lost and said, yep, I think you should go to the doctor. I didn't really know it then, but that was my first act as his caregiver, even though it didn't feel like I was a full-time caregiver at all. But I had stepped into that advisory and caring role that so many of us find ourselves in. And I'm sure all of you in this audience either have personal experience or know somebody well who has been through caring for a loved one and know how hard it can be. In my husband's and my case, he went through many months of trying to get diagnosed, turned out to have a very rare lymphoma. As I mentioned in the passage that I read, went through many months of treatment and a relapse onto a stem cell transplant that was terribly debilitating. He was hospitalized for 4.5 months. He wasn't able to see the kids during that time. I was back and forth to the hospital and doing everything at home that he and I would normally have done together, though we were very fortunate to have family help. He lost his vision. He lost his ability to eat. He came very, very close to death. He came home immune compromised on 35 different kinds of medications that I was managing and juggling and administering to him. And when he was discharged from the hospital after 4.5 months, his oncologist looked at me and said, when he comes home, he can't be left alone even for a minute. Now, I was already overextended and exhausted. And I just looked back at him and I said, how can I do that? That's impossible. I have kids, I have to sleep. And he said, usually families step in and it works out fine. I wanted to ask him if his family might be available because mine had already been helping and they had other things to do with their life. And they had been an invaluable support. But the question that I asked and the answer, usually family steps in and it works out fine, I think is really indicative of the out of sight, out of mind attitude toward family caregiving that often, all too often, prevails from the medical establishment, that makes it very difficult for caregivers to find support, even as they are providing immense amounts of support to their loved ones. And I just want to put in context slightly my own story of caregiving, because it's not just about, what I went through struggling to steer my husband through a really devastating set of illnesses, which he fortunately survived, though he remains chronically ill today. He's much more independent and able to manage his own care. But I was just one of what is now 53 million Americans who are family caregivers and counting. Those are the latest estimates from 2020 AARP surveys, caregivers. The statistics about how many people are serving as caregivers and the amount of work we are doing, is staggering. People are having to leave work in high numbers or reduce their work hours with obvious economic consequences. That falls much more heavily on women, who make up 2/3 of caregivers. And I would just say that I noticed in our very panel, we replicate that number of 2/3 women and 1/3 men serving as caregivers. And we can speak more about, the gender implications of caregiving in the Q&A or later on. Economically, as I mentioned, this is really challenging and devastating for caregivers. One statistic that I found mind-blowing is that female caregivers are 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty later in life compared to their peers who have not been family caregivers. Caregiving is also disproportionately done by women of color, and people in more difficult economic circumstances, which often unfortunately correlates with that, are more likely to be economically burdened. It's also a really challenging emotional journey. People feel isolated. I can certainly attest to that. I had really difficult time relating to my peers, even to close friends who weren't going through it. People suffer depression at high rates, are just tremendously challenged by the immense amount of time that caregiving demands. Currently, the average duration of caregiving is 4.5 years for unpaid family caregivers and 24 hours a week. And you can imagine that if you think about the time you're sleeping and the time you're working and the time that's left over, it's pretty hard to fit 24 hours a week into that with any kind of grace or ease. We all want to care for the people we love most. We want to see them through crises, through difficulties, through illness. And yet, for so many family caregivers, there's very little support for doing that sustainably, and that leads to burnout. That's kind of a quick overview of my own story and just putting the coming crisis and the looming gap of family caregiving into context. That gap is growing demographically as the baby boomers age. Now I'd really like to turn it over to Chris to speak a little bit about his story, and later we'll be able to have questions and a conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And I'd like to thank the event organizers, especially Jennifer Demas and the Fort Worth Public Library, for hosting this author panel this evening. My name is Chris Gabbard, and I wrote a book called A Life Beyond Reason, A Disabled Boy and His Father's Enlightenment, which was recently published by Beacon Press. This book is an account of my time serving as a caregiver for my late son, August. So here's some background information. August was my wife Eileen's and my first child. He was born in March 1999. Prior to the birth, Eileen's pregnancy had proceeded uneventfully. All signs pointed to healthy development. Unfortunately, the doctors delivering the baby mismanaged the birth, and August came into the world with catastrophic impairments, all of which stemmed from severe brain damage. Afterward, no one at the hospital ever explained to us what went wrong in the delivery room. Doctors can be tight-lipped about medical mistakes, but 16 years after August's birth in 2015, an anesthesiologist who had served on many obstetric cases told us that August's birth sounded like a classic example of labor dystocia, also known as obstructed labor. Following the birth, Eileen and I took our severely brain injured baby home and named him August, which means esteemed or venerable. And as I enumerate the list of his official diagnoses, I'm going to sound like a zealous district attorney overcharging a murder suspect, piling charge after charge on, but here goes. There was hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, cerebral palsy, spastic quadriplegia, profound mental retardation, cortical visual impairment, microcephaly, seizure disorder, and osteopenia. So during August's 14 years on Earth, he was nonverbal, incontinent, spastically paralyzed, and cortically blind. He couldn't sit in a chair in a way that typically a developing child would. He needed upper trunk support, so he had to be secured in his wheelchair with straps holding his shoulder and chest in place. Propped upright, his head lolled, falling forward and backward, and he drooled because the spasticity affecting his mouth prevented him from managing his saliva. When you laid him down on the floor, he was unable to crawl, scoot around, prop himself up, hold himself up, roll over, or even touch his toes. And if someone were to put him down in one spot on the floor and leave him there, you would find him in the same location an hour later, give or take a couple of inches. Because of August's significant impairments, Eileen and I undertook 14 years of extreme caregiving. Despite what extreme caregiving required, I never felt for long that taking care of August was pointless. For despite the troubled state of his body and mind, he was a jolly little fellow, the most cheerful person you can imagine, a munchkin delightful to be with. August died 14 years after his birth in October of 2013 as a delayed outcome of the way he was delivered. I'm going to read a passage from page 198 of my memoir. This passage comes from the last chapter, chapter 10, covering the period following August's death. This talks about what was happening primarily in the years of 2013 and 2014. Some of our friends mistakenly assumed that August's death brought great relief for Eileen and me. It is true that attending to a boy who couldn't do anything for himself had made the days hectic. Such caregiving required round-the-clock attention and meticulous tending and planning. But despite the difficulty, every day Eileen and I sallied forth with a sense of purpose. We never questioned what was important because we knew. Over time, the caregiving, a deceptively rewarding practice, had become deeply entrenched in our psyches and allowed bonds more intimate and intense to develop than those between most parents and their typically developing children. To care for a child dependent in every way, day after day, for many years, is to build up an emotional communion beyond the average person's comprehension. In every possible activity, we had to serve as our son's eyes, hands, and feet. Caring was taxing, time-consuming, and exhausting, a laborious, never-ending responsibility, an undertaking that was emotionally, physically, and financially draining. Yet it was also a tremendous event, a peak experience, the defining moment of our lives. And now we grieved its loss as well as the loss of our child. I'm going to now read from the start of chapter 4, which starts on page 86 of the memoir. This part describes or speaks to what was happening in the year 2006. So here's chapter 4. A sentence from the 1715 issue of Town Talk, a London periodical, summed up our sentiment. Quote, "It is a wise dictate of nature that we love those children dearest whom she presents to our care with the most infirmities," end quote. At the beginning of each day, I would pass through the laundry room and open the white door to August's sleeping quarters, a small room at the back of our house. August's little elfin grot was a space about the size of a one-car garage. The door, baseboards, and 2 window frames were painted white, and the 4 walls were a baby blue shade that Benjamin Moore called windmill wings. Every morning during early March, at a few minutes before 7 o'clock, a horizontal sunbeam would shoot through an east-facing window and flare diagonally through the chamber. For the time it takes a matchstick to burn, it would illuminate the room's west wall. The signature of this beam would be no larger than a quarter, and it would land just above and to the right of the headboard of August's electric hospital bed. Sherwin Williams would label this hue laughing orange. This spot on the wall was the sunrise, the cue for my ode to August. Wakey, wakey, I would call out as I came through the white door. I would touch his shoulder, pull down his covers, and then raise the window blinds. Light of the new day, a good morrow would stream in. August would open his eyes, stretch, coo, grin, and kick the bed covers with glee. From outside would come the resolute tapping of the woodpeckers and the morning calls of the gray catbirds and brown thrashers and mockingbirds, all singing their hearts out. This was our parliament of fowls. I would join in with my own morning call, the good morning song. As I began to sing the song sweetly, August would brighten further and wait for what he knew was coming. When I came to the penultimate line, I was screeched out in an exaggerated, creaky voice like that of Margaret Hamilton's Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. Hearing this, August would kick and squeal. I then would get him ready for the day by changing his diaper, bathing him, brushing his teeth, and dressing him. I loved his warmth, his body heat, as I tended to him. Every day, I would silently note that he had a belly button shaped like a jelly roll. And I'm going to forward here to page 189. Back in 1999, when we were still living in San Francisco, one of August's physical therapists had written in a report on account of August's brain injury, he had increased tone in all his limbs, but decreased tone in his neck and trunk muscles. This combination brought about, quote, severely limited active volitional movement, end quote. 7 years later, her assessment remained accurate. He couldn't move his limbs except for his legs, which he was able to kick, and his left arm, which he was able to flail. Moreover, August never improved intellectually. His developmental gap continued to widen. He was only going to make it to about a 1-year-old level by the time he was an adult, if that. He was like a baby who kept growing bigger and bigger without any increase in skills and abilities. The therapist producing this report was describing him from the vantage point of science, and that what she wrote was accurate as far as it went. Profoundly retarded was what another professional used, a term used regarding him. Retarded is the condition that society, in the words of Janet Lyon of Penn State, assumes to be, quote, the lowest rung of humanity, end quote. When Eileen and I brought August home from the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center years earlier, we had entertained high hopes regarding recovery from the brain injury. Dr. Anderson at the family consult, 7 days after the birth, had been encouraging, saying that August would probably meet his milestones. But Eileen and I had never encountered a child who was in this state. I myself was completely unaware that such children even existed. Had we parented August with only the doctors and the therapist's descriptions to go by, we might have thrown up our hands in despair. But we knew that August is more than a heap of terrible conditions. Because we saw that he was a happy and lively being, we didn't let the medical terminology govern our thinking about him. We turned instead to the imagination, because that is what makes us human. Life without it would be life in a dungeon. If knowledge is power, imagination is destiny. A scientific empirical description turned August into human rubble, a car wreck that had happened in the delivery room. But imagination allowed us to move the medical diagnoses to the curb so we could reach our boy. In our mind's eye, he wasn't all that different. He was August, just one more member of an already quirky family. I'm going to close by reading a short passage from the books afterward. This part describes my thinking in 2018 as I was wrapping up the book's final draft about 5 years after August's death. This is on page 221. I was fortunate to have fallen in love with August. I was extraordinarily lucky that lightning struck. I didn't feel or ever feel for long that taking care of him was pointless. Loving such a child isn't always automatic, and it doesn't necessarily happen to other parents of significantly impaired children. If parents want to avoid going through what Eileen and I experienced, the slowly unfolding logic of modern times has already made it possible for them to do so. The rational solutions of the brave new world can spare parents from having to care for a child such as August. But knowing what I know now, I would not avail myself of these solutions, not for all the world. There were a few times, as I describe in this book, that I experienced the sensation while looking into August's eyes that I was staring into the face of God. The Spirit was within him, and my glimpsing it there served as a premonition of recognizing it in myself. At the time of his birth, I didn't know that he would develop into a beguiling little fellow, that he would elicit great love from us and from many other people, or that, like a spirit guide or a Yaqui shaman, he would introduce me to a separate reality. And I didn't know that this separate reality was actually the world of my own heart, my capacity to give and receive love. So I'm going to turn it now over to Deborah Cohan.
Thank you. That was so beautiful, both of you. It's such a gift to get to listen to other writers and thinkers, and I love what you both read. So I'll be interested in how how the audience interacts with us with our various stories. It's just different facets of caregiving, as Kate had so beautifully framed the context of caregiving in the country and the sort of context of caregiving for the three of us as well. I do want to say, Jennifer, thank you so much for everything that you did to pull this off and to get us together and to make it all happen. I had said to you on email, and it's worth repeating, that I don't think I've ever worked with someone, a host for an event, who's been so communicative and careful and just totally thoughtful and thorough. So thank you for what you've done to make this happen, and thanks to everyone for coming. So my book is titled Welcome to Wherever We Are, a Memoir of Family, Caregiving, and Redemption. And whereas Kate talked about caregiving for her husband and Chris talked about caregiving for his child, I am talking about caregiving for a parent. And in my case, it was my dad. But the reason that this became a book that I felt compelled to write, I often say I felt an ethical responsibility to write it. It's because my story of caregiving stands at the intersection of both caregiving and domestic violence. So my father was absolutely an adoring man. He was adoring, but he was also abusive. He was wildly creative and wildly cruel. He came up with the line, and it's kind of a weird coincidence, how'd you like a nice Hawaiian punch? He was in advertising, and he was, he was able to wield words and with sort of magic and precision, but at home, he also did that in a way that was very terrifying at times. And what I want to also back up and say is that this memoir, kind of in equal parts, really deals with domestic violence and deals with caregiving. Like one isn't really in the background of the other. They're very much intersecting. And my experience was not one of physical violence that landed me or my mother in the emergency room, as it so often does with domestic violence. It wasn't sexual violence at all, although I would call it like emotional incest, a lot of it. But what it was verbal abuse and emotional abuse, psychological, financial control. And the other dynamic that is really important to understand in domestic violence is that there was also so much in the way of threats. And so the threat of violence is often just as terrifying, if not more, than anything else, because it serves to really control the other person, in this case, my mother and me, because I'm an only child. So, so my dad was my first parent to die. My mother just actually died last year. And it's a very different story, but this book is really, it was a way for me to deal with this complex father, and to really kind of wrestle with what I had been working on professionally all my life. So so that's the other key piece of this for me, is this is almost like a professionally informed memoir. For over a decade, I worked with violent men, and I led counseling groups in Boston, and worked with, abusers who had gone through the court system, ones who had come through therapy, those who just volunteered. So I had this longstanding interest in domestic violence in my research, in my teaching, in counseling, in activist work, et cetera. And, of course, looking back on all of this, I realized that when I was wrestling with all that in my 20s and my 30s, it was all, kind of working out some other stuff too, with the person I really wanted to touch and change and see transform was my father, of course. So so this book tells the story of what happened when my dad, well, basically he fell on Christmas Day at Cleveland Hopkins Airport when we were supposed to go to Florida. My ex-husband and I were meeting him in Cleveland, where I grew up, and he was there, and we were all supposed to go on this lovely vacation with umbrella drinks on the beach and the whole thing. Those drinks wound up being those terrible mixer things in hospitals, the thickened liquids that they give people who are having then trouble swallowing. So my dad fell and broke his hip, and then he fell and broke it again a couple of years later. So when Kate actually told the piece about like how long caregiving goes on for, mine is about 8 years. So my dad, he died in 2012. He actually died 3 days before I started my new job, having just moved across the country from Boston to South Carolina, where I work now. And it was difficult, because the thing is that when he broke his hip, this often does happen, everything else came tumbling down too. And cognitively, there were a lot of changes, and he really started to develop dementia. So the passage I'm going to read to you is from that experience of dealing with him with the dementia. But I guess before I do that, I just want to really emphasize that my story is one of just the multidimensionality of dealing with ambiguity in caregiving, ambivalence in caregiving. Kate started to touch a little bit on the anger, and I probably had a very expressive face during it, because I so relate. It's like, and the gender piece of it, and the my parents divorced when I was just about to turn 30, and so this all happened when I was 33. So my mom got off, she didn't have to deal with this. She had reunited with her overnight camp sweetheart. Suddenly I was thrust into this role, this kind of having to do all this. And mine was also long distance. So I was in graduate school. I was trying to finish my doctorate. I was teaching up a storm, doing all this stuff. And when Kate talked about how there's such economic consequence of caregiving, I wanted to say that was something I remember in my mid-30s saying, it's really too bad that, yes, I have student loans, but I actually need a caregiving loan, because the trips to Cleveland from Boston were costing me, thousands of dollars, because I was going back and forth. My parents no longer, had the house. I had to stay in hotels. It was kind of hard to see my friends, because like what Kate said, they didn't totally understand. They were understanding, but they didn't understand, if that makes sense. It was like, I always had the older parents, and suddenly it was all happening. And I was just sort of catapulted into this role. And so, but also at the same time, trying to really reconcile what it meant to do this with someone who I really adored and I had also been afraid of, and who I knew adored me, but he said some really vicious things. You know, one time he said, "You'd make my life easier if you committed suicide." It's awful stuff, you know? So, you know, do you want to care for someone who says that? Probably not. But then you think about all the other things that you love and that you appreciate and that you know are good qualities that came from him as well. So it's complicated. So I'm going to just read to you a short passage from the book, and the technique that I use in the book is called the objective correlative. It's a literary technique where basically taking an object, in this case, very mundane objects, but they're very evocative, and then using them to kind of mine for deeper meaning. So the chapter I'm reading from is called The Gold Pen, but there are other chapters like The Dinner Table, Sugar, you know, things that are just very, as I say, very mundane, but that I really just deeply unpack and explore to look at all of these different issues of, you know, caregiving and domestic violence, but also marriage, remarriage, falling in love again, for my mother, for me, you know, the issues of only children, divorce late in life, which was for them, that was, I mean, they were 72 and 65 when they divorced, you know, that sort of thing. So kind of dealing with lots of other sociological issues as a sociologist, and also dealing with this as a counselor. So what I'm going to do is share with you another little technique that I did in this book, and particularly in this chapter, is that I really drew on my skills, I guess. I didn't know it at the time, but I guess I was really drawing on my skills as a qualitative researcher and as someone interested in a bit of ethnography, if you will. And so when I was at my dad's bedside, I was just furiously taking notes. And I always had extra stuff with me in case he was like falling asleep, or I had extra time. So I was grading papers, I was doing whatever, but I always had a legal pad and I always had a pen, and I just started writing. Well, so the piece I'm going to read to you, and I think it's a fun piece. If there's people in the audience who are writers interested in writing, you might be interested to know that this wasn't edited at all for the book. So this actually comes straight from the legal pad to the printer, which is kind of cool, actually. So it's like these raw notes that were when I was with my father, and then a little bit of reflection after, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. In the spring of 2009, I wrote this as my dad took a nap. I watch you as you sleep, not unlike you probably watched me as I slept as a newborn baby and as a young girl. In wonder, in awe, in calm, and in worry. A parent watches a child sleep with anticipation of a future. An adult child watches a sick parent sleep with only a sense of the past. You are finally still and quiet. You, a man I know, is chaotic and loud. We rest in this calm as you fall in and out of slumber, and as I grade papers. I need to study your face, memorize it, as I know I'll need it one day. Yet the you now is not the you I want to remember. In a few days, I'll be back with over 100 students, giving lectures, attending meetings, going to a concert, a lunch with a friend, a performance of the Vagina Monologues. And in my week ahead, I worry about being too busy, about running from one activity to the next, breathless. Yet one day, Daddy, you did this too, right? How would you restructure those days now? What did you hope for? What do you hope for now? With your tongue half out of your mouth, you resemble a little boy with Down syndrome. You look tired, though I can't tell if you're tired of this life. Yesterday, I bought you coffee from Caribou with one of their napkins that made a jab at Starbucks that said, quote, Our coffee is smooth and fresh because burnt and bitter were already taken. Whenever I see great lines and logos, I think of you. Your creativity still shines through as we leaf through Metropolitan Home and marvel at minimalist spaces. Your stained maroon sweatpants are pulled up halfway toward your chest and your stomach looks distended. Earlier today, I saw as you put imaginary pills to your mouth with your fingers, something I assumed to be a self-soothing ritual you performed after the nurse told you it was not yet time for more medication. Being in Cleveland, I'm surrounded by childhood friends hanging out with their dads, younger men than you, in their 60s and the early 70s. Robust, athletic, energetic men, vigorously playing tennis and golf, working, traveling, and chasing after their dreams, not figments of their imagination in thin air. Oh, Daddy, your eyes open suddenly and you ask, what are you writing? I quickly respond, oh, nothing, it's just for school. However, writing about my dad in front of my dad seemed like a profound act of betrayal. It also felt mean. As I see it now, it helped me grieve and let go. Contained in a tight, unattractive physical space with my dad, enmeshed in his care in ways I probably should have never been, I was writing to untangle a knotty family narrative, to finally record and understand my experience as my own. By writing in front of him, I think something else happened that was necessary. I came to realize that all we had to give each other was space, psychic space. Most importantly, I needed to give him space and quiet to eventually die. My dad's almost 8 years of debilitating illness made me grasp his final inability to help and to guide me, and that gave me the space I needed to dream of what I wanted to do. Though he helped me and was involved in most major decisions that I had made in my life, dementia forced him to check out. It also forced me to check back in with how well I was writing my own life. So, oh wow, we're actually at exactly almost 8:15. That was amazing, right? So it's 8:14. So I guess, Jennifer, we can turn it over to you to facilitate the Q&A, and thank you. I can't wait for your questions and discussion.
All right, so if you have questions and you're online, post them in the chat and we'll ask them. And then, do either one of you here in the audience have a question? Okay, so I'll start with some of the ones I already wrote down. So I actually want to go back to something that Kate had mentioned. If it's not one of my planned questions, but I think we should talk about it. You talked about gender roles and how that affects with caregiving. Can you kind of talk about how what that is, and things that then that affects throughout other parts of someone's life?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And then Chris and Deborah, if you want to jump in at any point, please, by all means. As I mentioned, unpaid family caregiving is disproportionately done by women. It's about 2/3 by women. And the studies also show that women take on like longer hours, and often, though certainly by no means exclusively, often more physically and like demanding and more intimate sorts of tasks as caregivers. And one of the things that I write about in my book, which is really a story of, it has kind of 3 strands. It has my own caregiving story. It talks about the landscape of caregiving in America, some of the facts and figures that I shared in my brief overview. And then it also really looks at cultural representations of caregivers in books, a little bit in movies, in popular culture. And I really argue that a lot of the gender norms that we see for women really push us into caregiving roles a lot of the time. It's highly valued to be a good caregiver, to be unselfish, to be generous with your time. Often that leads to really constrained choice for people. A lot of people don't feel they have particularly a free choice in going into a caregiving role, whether that's because of, their sense of obligation and the kind of the socialization about gender and other roles that they have, or because there's simply nobody else to do it and you have to step in. I think, Deborah spoke to this a little bit, as the only child of divorced parents who was going to take care of her dad. It was on her. And we don't want to leave the people we love behind. And I think that our kind of gender roles really contribute to those feelings of obligation, and can also then contribute to feelings of resentment or challenge, or I spoke a little bit to anger, but then to wanting to hide that, which then even further amplifies the emotional challenge. And I'll kind of leave it there and ask if Chris or Deborah, if either of you want to jump in on those points.
Well, I can jump in, I guess, speaking from I'm not going to say from a male point of view, but I will say that from what I've been able to determine from my reading and my understanding, I'm actually trying to investigate this subject in a scholarly way, in an academic way, is the idea that a lot of men do feel that caregiving is unmanly. And there's a lot of gender expectation that a man take on that role. And there's something wrong with a man who would allow himself to be shifted into that role. And so one of the reasons I wrote my book was I wanted to be, I'm not by far the first person to do this, but I did want to put out that it is possible for a man to take on that role, and that it is doable. And I want to try to model what that would look like for people. I have to explain how I got into it. For the first 10 years of August Life until 2009, I would say that Eileen probably did about 60% of the caregiving and I did about 40%, because that was the years when I was trying to get tenure. So if you know, publish or perish, if you don't succeed in publishing, then you do not get, and then if I did not get tenure, I'd give up my job and we'd have to move, which would have been catastrophic for us given our finances. But then I got tenure, and then Eileen had a neck injury brought on by lifting August. He had grown to be 70 pounds and she had a herniated disc in her neck and had to have a disc replacement. And after that, her doctor said, you can't pick up any weight more than 50 pounds, which meant that she was not going to be able to do a lot of August care because August required constant lifting. And so that required me to shift drastically to that. I probably went to about an 80% or 90% caregiving role, because I had to be the one to take him to all the doctor's appointments and all to the therapies, and then take him to school, pick him up after school, do all his nighttime regime, do his morning regime. Anything required me to, because he had to be constantly lifted. So I basically, starting in about 2009, I didn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to any conferences. I couldn't go travel. I couldn't do anything away from the house for more than about 6 hours. And for that 6 hours, he was at school. So the long and short answer of this is that most men go into it kicking and screaming if they go into it at all. And that's because they've been trained since they were boys to not allow themselves to be drawn into that role. And I am thinking hard about what it is that would bring about a cultural change that would make it more acceptable for men to do that, so they wouldn't feel as though they are obligated by their gender expectation not to do that.
Forgot that I muted myself. Sorry about that. So what interconnections do you three see between each other's stories?
We were all angry. But we were angry at different people. I was angry at the doctors. I was never angry at August for a second, because I always thought I was on his side. They did this to him, and so I was angry at them. So I never had. That's one reason why it was easy to love him, because we were against the doctors. But the others had other, obviously with Deborah, there's a whole bunch of tangles, emotional tangles going on there.
Next question. How did your caregiving change your relationships with your partners?
I mean,
Do you want to tackle that first?
I could start with that since my caregiving was for a partner, and then turn it over to the two of you. And this may go back a little bit to the previous question about connections among our work, because I think that, for me, the caring relationship really profoundly changed the marital and spousal relationship. It's very different to go from having, for me, it was very different to go from having a relatively equal partner to somebody who was in a lot of really important ways quite dependent. And he, for a long time, needed really fairly intensive care. He was, quite incapacitated, especially when in the hospital. And I think there is lingering trauma from that. He certainly has an immense amount of medical trauma, and I have kind of secondhand trauma about being there, seeing the degree to which he was incapacitated, the challenges of that. He has not recovered, full function in many different arenas, and he can't work anymore. So it's very, because he continues to be immune compromised and for other reasons. He does have more ability to be independent, to act as a parent. He got his vision back, so like he can drive and go to the store and things like that. So some of those things have certainly improved, but it's been a real process. And I recognize that I'm fortunate among the three of us. I'm the only person whose care recipient survived the period of caregiving. And so I don't want to, say too much about, complain too much about that, because I recognize that it's a fortunate position and a blessing, but there is grief involved at all stages of caregiving. I think, for me, the loss of the partnership I had was something I had to mourn, and ongoing, the changes in our lives have been challenging to adjust to, for sure. I think, there's role reversals in caregiving. When you're caring for a parent, it's not the way you expected to ever relate to your parent, and that can be challenging. It was really challenging to relate to a spouse. Chris and Deborah can speak to how caregiving affects partnership when it's not the function, the direct part of the caring is not between the spouses, but I'll turn it over to them.
Sure. What I'm going to do is actually read you a paragraph, because it just answers it itself. This was my ex-husband, Mark. This is from a chapter called Medical Records, because I got very compulsive about making all these lists that were so that everybody had the information. And so that, like, if I was stuck in the car and I got phone calls, I was just always like at the ready, because that's the thing. We haven't used this word, the three of us, but I can almost guarantee that we all felt it. There's a sense of hypervigilance in caregiving, because you're like, it's demanding that you pay attention at all, all the time, like what's about to happen and what just happened and what could happen, what might happen. It's just, that's kind of amazing like that. And then of course, writing itself is, it's really the act of learning how to pay attention, especially to write memoir. So that's also something that we obviously have in common here with that. But I said in this chapter, years ago, I came home from a solo trip to Cleveland and said to Mark, very matter-of-factly, what if next time I go, I just poison my dad? Get some pills, help him die sooner, without all this pain. Looking at me a bit horrified, he said, but Deb, you can't, you'll be caught. Mark was so rule-bound, so careful, so cautious, drove me crazy. But who would ever know, I pressed on. Deb, come on, they have ways of figuring this stuff out. Mark replied, increasingly impatient with me. And with the snippy tone, I snapped back, well, if your parents ever get this ill and you have to deal with this kind of shit, I bet you'll want to help them end it, and fast. Oh, trust me, before I had fantasies of helping my dad die faster and with greater ease, I was obsessed with everyone knowing everything possible just to keep him alive. At some point in caring for my dad long distance, I thought it would be best to make an emergency list for the nursing aides to have on the refrigerator at his apartment. It was before he was in the nursing home. I proceeded in my typical obsessive compulsive fashion to distribute copies to everyone I could, his doctors, Mark, even my mother. I figured that if anyone should call to ask any questions, we all needed to have the correct information documented. So I'll stop there. It was tense. It really does add a dimension. Like it definitely, I think in certain ways it affected our marriage, but I will say that that's not why we divorced though. And one of the greatest gifts that Mark ever gave me was the capacity to love my father and to love my mother and to be very understanding of the complicated dynamics, because the first time he ever met my parents was on my mother's 60th birthday. He had come to Cleveland to visit in 1995. And at the dinner table, my dad actually called my mother an ungrateful fucking cunt. So that was his introduction to my parents. And it was very, very shameful for me. And it was really, really hard. Sorry, I guess I'm the only one who's using all the bad language, but somebody's got to do it, you know? I mean, and that also is real.
Somebody has a potty mouth.
And I feel like I'm the one.
I'll just talk about my relationship with Eileen, and the long story is that it brought us together and made us very tight. We had to work as a team. There was no way we could have carried this off if we had been greatly at odds. But I have to say that every day was rocky. We were always, the hypervigilance was very stressful and nerve-wracking. And so I can't say we always were at our best behavior with each other during that long period of caregiving. But on the other hand, I think it really, really brought us in close together. I mean, trauma sometimes unites people. I mean, sometimes it divides and creates hatreds, but in our case, I think the shared trauma actually joined us together. So if you were to look at our relationship on a day-to-day basis, you might be horrified. But if you look at the overall trend line, trajectory of it, it was actually very solidifying for us. But I'll say one more thing, that it's often said that parents of disabled children have a high divorce rate, higher than the typical divorce rate. And I have to say, I've tried to track down the source of that information, and most people who seem to know about it say it may be true, but there's no statistical backing for it. There's no studies that have ever really been highly justified to say or to validate that idea. So it may be true, but it's never really been borne out by any study.
All right, so we have a question here in the room. So you want to ask? My name is Deborah.
Deborah, you were discussing something about caregiving for your dad, and you felt like you wanted to poison him and do something to him, to end it fast. I have a brother who's like that. And I stepped in when I saw his stress level, and I feel the stress level, but I don't feel that way. And I was willing to give up a lot of my job and money to stay with my mother and try to calm the situation down. Now he fights me. He wants in a nursing home. He wants her out of there. He fights me constantly. He said he's going after me. And she's scared to death of him. She's called the police on him several times, and she's scared for me. When I just leave, she is scared for me, because it's like he wants her. He just feels like that your time's up. And he's told her to her face in front of me. And he's told her in front of my daughter that you need to go on, and she wants to live. And she is trying. And me and her, we fuss and fight and everything, but it's always about moving forward. It's like, Mom, you need these people here so you can walk. It's stuff like that. And so I'm used to just turning it around and going on. But I think she abused him so much, because my mother has an abusive mouth. She's abused him so much that I think he was just, I thought I was witnessing a nervous breakdown one day. He was crying. He's a big, stocky guy, and he was like in tears. And that made me step in. I said, what this is not fair for one person to have this. And now I'm the one person. You know what I mean? So I feel where he was, but I didn't have it the duration that he had it. But now he's fighting me like everything. And she wants me to come in and move in. I'm actually scared to move in because I'm scared I had to call the gas company because we had gas leaks. I'm scared he's gonna blow both of us up. He's gonna get rid of me and her. So that's where I am right now. My problem is with him. He discredits me. I raised my 3 kids and they said, Mom, what is going on with him? They are so surprised at his whole attitude because he has this, I don't know what's happened. And I don't know if he snapped, but when you were explaining that you said you just felt like putting him out of his misery, that's how I feel like he feels. He just wants to put my mom out of her misery. And she's not to me. I mean, she has good days, a lot of good days. He thought she was demented and she just had low oxygen. When I get her oxygen up, she's back to normal. But if you never see about her oxygen, never see about her, it's down and she is in a crazy zone. And I know she's in a crazy zone then. So, but I go check her oxygen, pull her back up, call the EMT, they get it back up, she's normal.
What is your first name?
Jermaine.
Jermaine, thanks for sharing all of that. I appreciate it. I guess I'm wondering, like, do you have a question?
The question is, when you came to that, you love your father, you love him, but how did you come to that? I mean, is it a line you can draw that you could separate yourself? Because I've been trying to get him, separate yourself. You don't have to be here. You
mean when I actually reached that point of I could just poison him? Yeah. No, I mean, that was, it's really
I'm angry all the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's also very interesting, I'll just say, because caregiving does create a lot of places where people are angry. And for women who are then more often saddled with it, it's more complicated because women's anger is less understood and validated in the culture. Like, women aren't supposed to be angry. That's the other piece.
It's like you're not supposed to be angry,
Right. And then also when you are angry, women are supposed to be angry on behalf of other people, on behalf of their children. They are not supposed to be angry because they are angry themselves.
Right. Because that's wrong and it's angry. Yeah.
Right. So I think the thing that I can say is that my dad would not have wanted to live like that. So I wasn't saying, and I really hope everybody understands this, like, that I wasn't saying this out of cruelty or wanting to kill my dad or anything like that. No, it was totally like about, he would have hated the last years of his life if he had really understood what was going on. And it was, and he had said, even for years when he was well, never let me be that person. And so, like, my grandmother, my mother's mother had dementia. And
that's what she's going through. Exactly that.
Right.
Said, don't let me get there. And it's like he's intentionally letting her get there because I come in, her oxygen will be off. And I said, what happened? Well, he grabbed it and took it from me. It's like he's wanting her to get there.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to keep her sane because she said, they're going to make me sane. And then I won't even know myself. And she doesn't want to be like that. Right. She doesn't want it. She wants to live.
Yeah. That's exactly the thing is that, like when you just said that I don't know myself, my dad had comments like that at the end where it was like, it was very clear to me that this was not, this wasn't a happy situation for anyone. It wasn't really me selfishly just because I wouldn't have been able to pull it off, frankly. And in fact,
he thinks like you. It's not uncommon to think like that, I'm sure, especially if it's abusive because it's dementia. And I'm telling you, I hear really crazy accusations against him all the time from her. And I could tell that, oh, it's good. He got out of here. But then she does me like that too. And I just get angry, but I'm there, I'm back. But he's like, had it up to here. He's like, had it up to here. But why do just because you had it up to here, I think he's thinking that she is, because she does it with him. She really goes crazy when she sees him. Okay. So it's like now she's got, I'm saying abuse. It's like dual abuse. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
for
it's not
sure.
one-sided, but she's vulnerable. So I'm there.
Right.
She's vulnerable. He can walk off anytime. Me, she can't walk. So she's stuck.
You know, just as a source of support for you, the Texas Council on Family Violence is one of the best state coalitions on the topic in the country, actually. And I used to live in Austin, Texas. That's where I got my master's. So I'm familiar with the Texas Council. And they might actually have some support, you know, for understanding a little bit more of the dynamics of the abuse and control, so that you can kind of manage the complexity of both of their stories, because you're sort of in between,
Yeah.
you know, caring about your brother, caring about your mother, and then going, you know, you're gonna like go crazy yourself feeling. So it's one of those
I've been going crazy, ma'am. Not like going crazy. I have been on edge, blood pressure is crazy high.
yeah. So
Heart
that's why,
problems just come up that one didn't exist. I don't get to sometimes take care of myself.
absolutely.
I wanted to come to this meeting and I just got blasted. And my mother was trying to make sure I come to this meeting. But
It's cool that you can.
interference from my brother just didn't want me to be there. I guess he wanted me to leave her and not come. It's
She
just,
missed the beginning, but you can watch the recording.
I
So, yeah.
want it. I
Yeah.
want to,
Yeah.
because I want to see your situation, particularly because you had two issues. You had two, your husband and then you had your father thing. So your book, I got to see you got a book?
Yes.
I got to see
Oh,
your
yeah.
book. You're the one that I'm going to be looking at. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because you had to deal with a lot of round. And I used to do caregiving and group homes because I liked it. Okay. And so I didn't have a problem doing this for my mom. You know what I mean? I just don't have a problem. I moved to live near her to do it because me and my daughter were thinking about opening a group home and just doing it. We just, you know, I don't mind doing that. I draw, I do stuff like that, but I like doing that. So I didn't have a problem doing it, but it's so nice when you're in the group home and stuff because you get to go home and relax. And you know what I mean? You get some time off and it's just no time off. And you know that.
Right, right.
No, it is no time off.
That's so true. Well,
24 hours.
In terms of time, I'm wondering, I mean, I love what you've shared and it's so raw and real, but, you know, and just it underscores so much of what we're talking about. I'm wondering, Jennifer, are you seeing that other people have questions so that we can sort of share the floor more? So
Yes.
other people can.
We have one more
Okay.
question that we'll ask and then you can keep that. Yeah, we have one more question and then we're good. So the last question is, what social structures need to change to further support caregivers?
Well, it needs to be a vast expansion of the social safety net, for one thing. This would have to do, say, in Florida, where we have something called consumer-directed care, but it's woefully underfunded by the state legislature. It allows for community or service in the home, often to people like me, but there's a long waiting list in our state. There's a Medicaid waiver, which in a lot of states, people are on long waiting lists. And I think Florida has one of the longest waiting lists. So there are structures in theory, but they're not anywhere near fully funded. The current legislation in Washington, D.C. is intended to address a lot of the issues that we're talking about tonight. It wouldn't solve these problems, but it certainly would be a big step forward. But you know, that legislation is stalled. And we needn't go into a discussion about why it's stalled. I think there's a lot of people to blame for it being stalled. Not necessarily the usual suspects. I think there's a lot of other people who are responsible for the failure of this legislation. I'll turn it over to the others.
Yeah, I would echo what Chris said. Actually, the last chapter of my book is all about kind of change we could see to actually truly solve or address the caregiving crisis. And I think that starting with simply having things like paid leave, paid family leave that would enable people to take paid time off from work and have some flexibility to care for their loved ones. We've seen so poignantly the need for that during COVID. And that is part of the legislative package, though the amount of paid leave that was initially included in that has really dropped. And some states do have that. You know, certain states in the US are doing more around caregiving policy than others. There's kind of differences across the board. I think, you know, there's a role for private enterprise as well. There are opportunities for, I would love to see, you know, insurance coverage for respite care. Currently, it's very difficult to get any kind of help to get respite care. People who are on Medicaid or certain forms of assistance can use respite care workers and have that be covered, but your assets and total income have to be extraordinarily low, like well below the poverty limit in many states in order to get that kind of relief. So that leaves families just doing it all 24 hours a day. You know, when my husband was ill, and I to hark back to what I said at the very beginning about the doctor who said, you know, he needs to be looked after 24 hours a day. You can't leave him alone even for a minute. You know, in the end, we hired private caregivers and paid them out of pocket and used our savings to do that. And we were so incredibly fortunate that we were able to do that. It saved my sanity. And it was something that he really needed only for a period of a few months. But you can imagine people with ongoing illnesses that last for years who need attendant care. That's just not attainable for most families. So structures that would better support, you know, people are discharged from the hospital needing really intensive levels of care. You know, I personally gave my husband IV nutrition, gave him IV antibiotics. There's very limited training for that. So training and preparation for caregiving would also be structures that would support family caregivers better pay, better training for paid caregivers, and better coverage for that would go a long way as well. I mean, the list goes on and on of, you know, what we could do with the social safety net, but I'll throw it to Deborah to see if you have anything you'd like to add to all of those, you know, that big wish list that I just said.
Yeah, I mean, both of you articulated a great list. I suppose just, you know, living and breathing in the educational arena, I would say that in, you know, education structures could really change in term, and that also kind of goes back to what Chris said earlier with his own story in terms of like hoping that he and others might be able to affect some change in terms of men feeling like actually it's very manly to do this rather than not. You know, so like, since education is such a way in which people are socialized to just become human beings, you know, both K through 12 as well as college and everything else, that I think those, you know, at every kind of age appropriate level, there are ways to be able to talk about caregiving and self-care and these different pieces, and also just emotion, because we really, I mean, emotional intelligence is so crucial, and there's not a lot of sign of it being taught well and modeled well in educational settings, and that would also go far. So when I think about social institutions and social structures that might help to change things, I'm also thinking more in terms of just the kind of social fabric that is woven under it all, that could launch people into a better spot to be able to do this better, and to not be so blindsided, or to not feel so like outrageously alone, or just I mean, Kate's comments keep pointing to how unsustainable the whole thing is, you know, and that's something else. So yeah, I mean, I think we could probably think about all different sorts of parts of our society that really could change, but certainly to me, education is a huge piece of it. It's where people also learn to be boys and girls, men and women. And so it's really ripe for some of those seismic and gradual changes.
I could just build on what Kate and Deborah have said. I think there has to be something where we have to educate the public to understand that caregiving is not this infrequent thing. It's not this thing that happens just on the side only to a few people. It's actually woven into the very center of human life, that is part of a civilized society that provides care for those who are dependent for whatever reason. And I think the educational level is a good place to start. If I put it bluntly, we have to explain that caregiving is a thing. It's a thing, it's a part of regular everyday life. It's just not something that, oh gosh, who can we find somebody to fill in to take care of Uncle Joe? Some woman in the family probably will step up because she's not doing anything with her life. I think we have to normalize caregiving, that caregiving is actually part of every aspect of life. So education, I think, is the place to start.
Do you have time to do one more?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Can you comment on the difference between caregivers and caretakers?
Sounds to me like caretakers has more to do with custodial care, which means kind of a not very engaged form of taking care of somebody. And a caregiver, an ideal caregiver, would be one who is involved with the labor of caring and not doing a custodial job, just not doing the bare minimum, but instead is feeding or answering human need on all possible levels. Caregiving is all about answering a human need.
Yeah, I think earlier when Chris gave his individual presentation, he said something from his book about emotional communion. And that to me is the essence of the caregiving. And caretaking does have a little bit more of an antiseptic or less emotional quality to it. Like, so the people hired to come in and do some of that labor for my dad, well, some of them were just caretakers, not very good even. And some were more caregivers, some were on the fence. And actually, that's another thing I was going to say about structural changes that really need to happen is that so many people who work in these places, these they're like human warehouses, these nursing homes. And it's just, they're not compensated well. They're not caring for themselves well. And they're then also not caring for our own loved ones well. So it's a vicious cycle. So there's that as well. Like I was grateful to them in many ways, and I also was horrified in many ways. And so like when you know that the quality isn't so great, and like we all hear that, in the country, we're always hearing like, oh, the nursing homes are terrible, or oh, the quality of care isn't good. And it's like, that is something that really needs to change, and to raise the bar higher for that. But so, but I do think that, I always say caregiving, I don't say caretaking, because I think about like the people who take care of the lawn maintenance at my condo complex. They're caretakers. They care for the lawn. I don't know. My neighbor is a caregiver for my flowers in my flower box. It's different. It's like there's an intimacy to it that's different, I guess.
It's a difference between taking and giving.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I'll just jump in. The term caregiver is actually of surprisingly recent vintage. Like it does not appear in the literature until, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, because I see you nodding. I think the 70s is when it starts to be used. And then it in the medical and other literature, it's like flatline, and then it like takes off in like the 80s and 90s, the citations for it. So it's a pretty recent term, coinage. And I think, Chris and Deborah both spoke really beautifully to how it combines, this kind of giving and gift element. I think, the problem is that often that giving is not necessarily done freely. And that, as Deborah alluded to in talking about, caregivers in paid settings, that work is so underpaid, and the assumption that's woven into the very word that it's going to be freely given leads us to deeply undervalue that labor, both for unpaid family caregivers and for paid care workers or paid caregivers. And I think that if we think about how undervalued so much caring labor of all kinds is, teachers, honestly, any of the feminized professions or the professions that are thought of as female and that involve care for others, tend to be underpaid and often undertrained and undervalued, like undertrained in the sense of, childcare workers, health and care attendants, things like that. And yet they're doing the jobs that we really consider priceless. Like, if I think about when my grandfather, who I love deeply, was at the end of his life, I would have paid any amount of money to get him good care. And yet those jobs of the people taking care of the people we love and care about the very most are some of the least well paid, and in terrible working conditions, insecure. And we really need to change, if we go back to thinking about changing the structures of care, which comes first, changing the structures and the policies, or changing the culture and the way we think about it. And I think, we need a virtuous cycle to drive change in all of this, but we need cultural change in how we think about and how we value care. Unpaid family caregiving work is not counted in the GDP, and then we don't value it because it's not part of our economic engine. And we need to shift all of that. So that's I see preach come up in the chat. That's my preaching for the end, of our conversation.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. So I want to say thank you very much to the three of you for being here tonight. And for those of you who attended, I hope that you have learned some things to take away with you. If you would like to purchase copies of any one of these authors' books, you can get them at the Dock Bookshop here in Fort Worth. We have put a link to their website in the chat. And then you can also, of course, check them out for the library. So I just want to thank you for attending. And we have a lot of great other author visits coming up this year. Please check our website, fortworthlibrary.org, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.